Okay, video 3. Just moving into that question of context, the challenge of context, as I've been saying. Amongst this issue of metaphysics, we have that one method option that's available within Kant, and that is the transcendental. So what was going on there? Back to this sort of structural element. Now, for Kant, the transcendental, it's a feature of the intellectual approach that we do certain things with judgment. So that's bound up with metaphysics, yes, but one great progressive effort of Kant is to, setting metaphysics aside, is really to refine that idea of rational forms of thought, which he'd done quite successfully. And within that we have this transcendental. So it's conceived of firstly as preconditions for just about anything, because it's something that's bound up in our nature. So with that, he presents our, this is where the science bit comes in, our empirical relationship with the object. So we have an empirical relationship with the object, but that's not the total relationship. So as subjects, we have a relationship to the world, and there is an empirical component. That's how science can operate. But more reflective is the components of judgment. So what's going on there? If we're talking about rationality, we're usually talking about judgment. So that's a big feature of Kant. Empirical aside, that is the objective world, what's going on with us? So he's squarely in the category of subjectivity when he's engaging in establishing argument about the rational forms of thought. So those components of judgment, as subjects, we're reflecting on objects and the objective world, but also how subjects, humans with all their desires and their prejudices in relation to truth, how do they actually operate? What is the relationship between the judging mind, if you like, of the opinion and the object? So that will include things like the desire for truth, truth in relation to, let's call it a universal, because we use universals. So there's our language issues as well. But importantly, he's conceiving of subjectivity. That's a feature of Kant that we have to kind of understand enlightenment as a presentation of ourselves to ourselves. So we have this conception of subjectivity. It's not particularly strong in philosophy, by the way. It's when I was studying at university, it was a kind of a fringe concept to a point. Got caught up with postmodernity. But anyway, that's an aside. The point here really is that it was a key concept in Kant. Not that he specified it separate from, say, what we are as thinking subjects or what we are as humans and our human nature. It's not like that. It's a subtlety involved, and when we work up that concept of subjectivity, we're really working, as I say, on rational forms of thought, but one, knowing the history, but two, knowing that that's not the whole of subjectivity. The idea of the rational man has had its day in the 20th century, and typically the prelude was Nietzsche's pointing out that the time for that concept was yet to come. He called it the ideal man. And it's certainly true. The 20th century brought the rational man, and The idea of the rational man is still alive, well alive in a lot of our institutions. And of course, rational man brings us to a connection with feminism, because it's not, the rational man was also a divisive element of life for a long time for women. So one of the othering forms, one of the othering rational forms, if you like. Anyway, so transcendental seduction is preconditions, it's components of judgment, and it's from that, it's something that we can speak of as a practice in what we call objectivity. So if we're going about our business practicing objectivity, we are, in a sense, engaging in what at least Kant would call formulation of judgment, which will have logical components, and for logical components to occur, there's going to be preconditions to be met, and therefore there is this idea or thing in our subjectivity that we can objectively understand as transcendental. It's not a problem with that, it is only argument. We don't say it's gospel truth. It's not really a problem in that sense, because it's 200 plus years old now. It's not something new, but it certainly speaks to issues that we're familiar with. Kant, of course, was a titan of ethics, and I don't think it's until you see in the 20th century Levinas being such a feature of ethics, importantly. So, besides that, epistemology wouldn't be what it is without Kant, I don't think. Probably wouldn't be the same without Hegel either, because he's has a lot to say about the logic as well as the history. So I think touching on the transcendental, Kant's transcendental, and what we call objectivity, so that's a common understanding of our path to truth. Most people relate to the concept of objectivity, but not necessarily so the concept of history. The point here is that we have options from Kant and Hegel, and really 200 years since, but still, these are still key elements contained therein. So, for example, even Hegel, you can find in Hegel Nietzsche's declaration of the death of God, and you can also find the concept of the postmodern or postmodernity. And from memory, I think there's also arguments, I'm not sure if it's in Hegel, but the idea that the postmodern actually predates modern. So I think the argument goes that, back to Kant, these transcendental preconditions, that modernity's precondition is post-modernity. That's an interesting argument. I'm not getting into that at all right now. That's way off out there. But history aside, and philosophy proper, we do have this option of transcendental. Okay, so it's got its limitations, but it's worth pursuing, and that's what's occurring here in transcendental seduction. The alternate is, I suppose, Hegel's concept of spirit, which, as I said, it's a universalist kind of prejudice, and in a certain sense it's too objective and it's not accessible, and certainly for rational forms of thought and for subjects such as ourselves, or creatures such as ourselves, we don't really have that insight that Hegel ends up producing as a result of his philosophy, this absolute spirit. So really we've got to take a step back and say you're very good at history and thank you for all your effort, but what you're ultimately doing with your rational forms of thought are chasing down your desire for God. You're chasing down your lived Christianity. You are a product of your times. But the irony of ironies, we wouldn't know that. We wouldn't know how to critique Hegel in the way that we do without Hegel. So yes, he, in a certain sense, he's a peak. He's the peak of the Enlightenment. And much is made of the year of his death, 1830, when he ceases to exist. I suppose his philosophy becomes historical. Anyway, we use dialectic, Hegelian dialectic, especially in politics, and it's found to be useful. But it's limited also, and actually constitutes, does not actually constitute a new area of reflection, not like we do with the transcendental, which is as a mode of rational thinking and a vehicle for reasoning. We've got a new, for want of a better word, a new space in which to conduct our formal thinking, a space for rational forms of thought where we haven't been before. So that's the concept of the transcendental. You don't get that with Hegel. You do get the dialectic. You get that pattern. You get the real useful process science, if you like, in Hegel, that allows you to understand pattern. But when we get into reactive and active forces, we'll see that is also a problem. Okay, so critique of Hegel, fine, but that's not to say that phenomenology is not the preeminent use of reason in intellectual endeavours. I think we could say that because it's dealing with the raw data of phenomenon, and phenomenology develops out of the work of Kant and Hegel. So they're the Kant and Hegel pair in mind while trying to develop this understanding of the transcendental and why we should move from a transcendental deduction. So that is the deduction of the transcendental. This is what Kant gave us. He deduced the transcendental. And then giving context to transcendental seduction on that basis. So a space, even the metaphor space, it is metaphorical. When we say space, it's not something we can get our hands on. But it is a feature of subjectivity. That's not metaphorical. It's a legitimate description of what we are as humans, and that's something that philosophers are interested in. That's an irony of language too, that linguistically you're forced into metaphor, other forms of language in which to describe these elements of the rational forms of thought. Now these rational forms of thought, these aren't something, this is not my thinking, my opinion up here high in my head. It's more structural level that, as I say, Kant's conception of logic is the concept of necessity, that things are necessarily so in the relationship of the subject to the object. So when I say there's a space and I give a caveat about metaphor and linguistic issues, we're not actually saying it's not actually real. No one's going to be saying that, but this is just how you got to operate with language sometimes. Now, when I say transcendental seduction, am I saying that the transcendental is a seduction? Well, if I'm nihilist, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying, that the transcendental is a seduction, and it's not just because the historical factors, and not just because it's a linguistic construct, but it's also because you can't value it. And in fact, our values are bound up with it. Our values are bound up with the problem of it not being real. And that's really significant for judgment. So we want to be able to rely on our judgment. Now, we're always going to fall back on objectivity. There's no doubt about that. And this is what I'm doing is not about dismantling or critiquing objectivity. But objectivity stands regardless of what any philosophy does. Science will march on with its deductive strength. But really the problem, as I'm pointing out, is in the ordinary objective sense, transcendental is not real. But then it's not of that order of reality anyway. It's of the order of subjectivity. Now, as to whether the subject is the condition of the possibility of an object, not only are we back with Descartes' solipsism, but we're also in that kind of linguistic era of saying this thing here is real because. Now, how you describe that thing and how you judge it as real, those things, both those things can be caught up in the linguistics. Both those things can be stripped of value and we find nothing's left. So the earlier examples, mind and body and external world, they don't get critiqued and solved. They're perspectives, really. And philosophy's a set of perspectives, and transcendental seductions are perspective, just as transcendental deductions are perspective. So you never really get away from really the last great philosopher, Nietzsche, and perspectivism. Now, perspectivism clearly resolves the prejudicial problem of universalism. So within 100 years, philosophy's need for universalism really got dismantled, and that prejudice was really removed in the history of philosophy by Nietzsche. So here we are. Isn't that a good thing? But we have now perspectivism, and that's going to play a part when I speak or critique the metaphorical, or what Derrida calls metaphoricity, around our use of language, which will include the idea of a transcendental. So from that, really, in the final analysis, what we're doing is just a strong analysis of how our rational forms of thought and our language practice operates, and where perspectivism is the more sophisticated description of the situation than a purely value-based universalism, for example, would be, or any other kind of top-tier form of thought. Okay.